Hello there, I'm Ameera David. This is Boom Bust, and these are the stories we are tracking for you today. Greece has defaulted on its debt payment to the IMF, but the negotiations between the country and its creditors continue. I'll have all the latest on the rapidly evolving talks coming right up. Then Pavlina Tcherneva is on the show. We'll talk to her about the conditions by which Greece would accept a bailout offer. What exactly are they? She'll answer that for us. Then in today's big deal, Ed Harrison and I are talking tech with a specific look at the latest deal to scrap roaming charges in the EU. Can we ever expect to see something like that happen in the U.S.? We'll cover that and so much more on today's show. You don't want to go anywhere because it all starts right now. At the stroke of midnight early Wednesday morning, Greece became the first advanced economy to default on the International Monetary Fund. The default has wide implications, but was more or less expected as the country and its creditors failed to hammer down the parameters of a bailout deal. But even though Greece is now technically in arrears, it has continued to attempt negotiations with its creditors. And on Wednesday, the government indicated it was willing to accept many of the terms of a bailout package that it had previously rejected. However, that's only if the acceptance were part of a broader deal to release funding over the next 2 years. There was no definitive response from European leaders outside of German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who said there should be no further negotiations until Greece carries out its referendum on Sunday. The referendum will gauge whether or not the public wants to accept the terms of a previous bailout offer, with many saying this vote would determine whether the Greek people want to remain in the Eurozone. However, Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras has been careful not to frame the vote that way. Take a listen to what he had to say in a national address.
Greek women and men, we are at a critical point in our country's future. Sunday's referendum is not about whether the country will remain in the Eurozone or not. That is a given, and no one can doubt that. On Sunday, we choose whether we will accept the specific agreement or seek a more viable solution with the public's approval. I want to reassure the Greek people that the government's unwavering intention is to reach an agreement with its creditors, but with terms that are viable and have potential.
As you heard there, Tsipras says he remains committed to the negotiations and to securing a deal with its creditors. But as the Greek saga drags on into its 5th year now, many are questioning whether reaching that deal is even possible. Talk about the latest out of Greece. Pavlina Tcherneva is on the show. Pavlina is an associate professor of economics at Bard College. She is also a research scholar at the Levy Economics Institute. Greece has officially missed its 1.6 billion euro debt payment to the IMF. However, Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras told international creditors that he could accept their bailout offer if some conditions were changed. So Erin first asked Pavlina what those conditions could be. Here's what she had to say.
Okay, they've gone through very many iterations of negotiations. The latest statement from yesterday, Tsipras seems to have accepted virtually all conditions of the IMF, though he's still holding out on pensions, and specifically the solidarity grant, the one that goes to the poorest of the poor pensioners. He would like to push back the date that solidarity grant is going to be phased out. I think the IMF wanted 2017. He's asking 2019. And he's also holding out on the subsidies and the tax breaks for the poorest islanders. But virtually all of the other IMF demands he has agreed to consent to.
That kind of goes against his party in a lot of ways. How is that sat with the Syriza party and those who voted for him?
Well, not very well. But really, I think it's fair to say that Syriza has been caught in a catch-22 from the very beginning. Syriza was voted in on a no austerity platform. People had spoken. The ministers went into the negotiations. They had articulated their no austerity position. They were not met with much sympathy. And now it seems that they're at the end of the line and there's nothing very much to do. And really, the reason for this is that Greece does not have much leverage. They really do not have the ability to influence their macroeconomic policy. So what Tsipras has done is he has called for a referendum to perhaps one more time articulate the will of the people, the no austerity vote, which was already articulated when Syriza was voted into office.
I'm glad that you bring that up, and I do want to get to this referendum. It's a big deal. It's happening on Sunday, and we have to talk about that. But first, can you talk to me about Greece's debt restructuring? You mentioned it briefly, but can you talk to us specifically pension cuts, tax revenue increases, and budget surplus plans?
So basically, here we have conditions for continued funding for Greece. These conditions are economic restructuring conditions that the IMF and the Troika have requested. They have largely focused on pension reform, labor markets reform, and privatization. Now, the idea here is to find a viable economic model to permit Greece to pay off its 320 billion debt, which makes sense. But every independent analyst has said that this debt cannot be repaid under current conditions. In other words, what we have here is for Greece to continue getting funding, they have to commit to these economic conditions. At the same time, the discussions for restructuring the debt are separate. And naturally, they need to be tied together. We need to know how much of the debt will be restructured, how much may or may not be written off. So in other words, we don't have a good way of assessing the ability of Greece to repay its debt because we don't know what the debt is going to be. We are working on the presumption that we have 320 to address. And that cannot happen in conditions of depressed demand and economic stagnation.
It's kind of amazing when you don't have all the variables necessary to deduce an appropriate answer, and then you're required to create that. It's kind of a scary situation. But, you know, the new proposal for budget cuts and policy overhauls, it was dismissed by European officials. That was on Wednesday, so today, actually. This week is going pretty fast. And they saw this proposal as inadequate in terms of kind of reviving negotiations, getting everyone back to the table, and also to give Athens a bailout. It wasn't enough. So can you talk to me about what was in that proposal and why specifically Euroland was not keen to play ball there? Okay, so there are so many details. They've gone back and forth on so many various details. The big picture is that Europe has still required about 2 to 3% fiscal tightening of Greece, which is comparable to the first round of austerity. Now, we know what happened with the first round of austerity, and even the IMF has acknowledged that it has not worked and it has not brought growth. In fact, their forecasts had been consistently incorrect. So the big picture is that we're talking of a tightening, a consolidation of comparable magnitude. And then the details matter. How do we bring about this fiscal tightening? So the negotiations have really focused on what kind of tax increases would solve the problem. Now, Tsipras had drawn the red lines, the famous red lines in the sand, and argued that they will not negotiate on increasing value-added taxes and pension reform. And yet he has crossed those lines. He has yielded virtually to every one of the European demands. What's really striking, however, is that the IMF had rejected specific tax increases proposed by the Greek government that will fall on the gambling industry, as well as a one-off 12% increase in corporate taxes to meet the tax revenue that is asked of them. So the Troika had rejected this plan as anti-growth, but at the same time they have insisted on continued cuts in pensions and the elimination of the solidarity grant. And this important bracket is that pensions have already been reduced by 40%, and that half of pensions pay poverty incomes. So it is very difficult to make sense of this insistence that
breaks for the poorest islanders and pensioners need to be phased out, and yet rejection of these tax increase proposals on wealthier segments of society.
All right, time now for a quick break, but stick around because when we return, Boom Bust's Erin Ade is on the show. She'll tell us about the new international bank that China is developing. Then in today's big deal, Ed Harrison and I are talking tech with a specific look at the latest deal to scrap roaming charges in the EU. Can we ever expect to see something like that happen in the U.S.? We can only hope. All of that and more is coming right up. Stay with us. And as we go to break, here are the closing numbers at the bell.
What politicians do is something we don't do. They put themselves on the line, and they get accepted or rejected. So when you want to be president, why would you want to be? Why would someone want to be president? What's it like to be president? What's it like when the phone rings at 3 in the morning? Can't be a good call. I'm interested always in the whys and the hows.
And cue Larry.
Question more.
I'm Jesse Ventura, and I bring you the truth, loud and clear. I was a Navy frogman, a professional wrestler, and the governor of Minnesota. Now I'm taking you off the grid. Join me every Friday for Off the Grid on RT. Question more and stay vigilant.
I'm Wolf Blitzer, you're in the situation. Not now for the ridiculous.
Elect Republicans and they will burn the place down.
This is my problem with liberals.
I'm the resident. Let's talk about that.
They're the war hawks selling you on the idea that dropping bombs brings peace, to the chicken hawks forcing you to fight in the battles that they start.
The news hawks try to tell you that celebrity gossip and tabloid murder trials are the most important news of the day.
While the hawks of advertising tell you that you are not cool enough unless you buy their product.
Watching the hawks. Watching the hawks.
These are the hawks that we, along with our audience, will be watching.
Welcome back to the show. The internet has already transformed our world in a number of ways. It's revolutionized the way we manage our health and even the way we fight our wars. But with all of that comes security concerns, and the government is trying to fix that. Boom Bust's Bianca Facchinei has more.
According to the Federal Trade Commission, there is now 25 billion internet-connected devices in the world, and experts expect that to double in 5 years. By 2025, internet-connected devices could generate up to $11 trillion worldwide. But with the good has certainly come the bad in terms of security and privacy, and Washington is hoping to tackle that. Earlier this year, a new group of lawmakers called the Internet of Things Caucus formed on Capitol Hill. Started by Representatives Susan DelBene and Darrell Issa, the group's focus is to educate members of Congress on emerging technology. They also hope to protect consumers, but any security technologist will tell you that's going to be a little difficult.
This is going to be a fruitful avenue for attack. If you think about some of the large-scale data breaches, some of them came through point-of-sale terminals, which is the same thing. A thing that's not very well designed, that's cheaper, more ubiquitous, and attached to the internet.
So when you factor in design, efficiency, and most importantly, cost, effective regulation becomes tricky. Congress can try imposing regulation, but that'll be hard to accomplish without stifling innovation. Achieving anything other than awareness will be especially challenging when some lawmakers admitted to not even knowing what the Internet of Things is. So for now, the best step we can take is understanding our increasingly interconnected world before we start legislating it.
Very interesting, Bianca. So what do you think? I mean, do you have a sense as to whether this caucus will be effective at handling technology-related issues?
I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. Del Beni used to work for Microsoft, and Issa made his fortune in electronics. So they both have a big tech background, which is good. And she is a Democrat, and he's a Republican, so it's nice to see some bipartisanship on the Hill for once. So I think, you know, it's good in terms of consumer protection, but I don't think, other than looking out for their constituencies, they're not really going to. They're going to have a hard time passing bills or, you know, trying to regulate it as much as they probably want to. So
got you.
It's a good and bad.
Good and bad. Very important stuff considering our world is just becoming more and more digital. Thank you so much, Bianca. I appreciate it. China officially ratified an agreement with the world's largest emerging nations on Wednesday to create a new development bank. Joining us now live from New York to discuss this is Miss Erin Ade. Erin, as I understand it, this new development bank is just one of two new international banks that China is now working on. Is that right?
That is absolutely right, Ameera. However, the one that gets a lot more attention, a lot more coverage that you've all out there probably heard of, that's the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And the reason a lot more people are looking at that is because a fair amount of U.S. allies like Germany, Australia, France, the UK, they have all joined the development bank at the ire of the United States. However, the new development bank that you're referring to is also known as the BRICS Bank, not just the new development bank, but the BRICS Bank. And it is designed as an alternative to Western institutions like the World Bank. And on Wednesday, China's legislature, known as the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, they approved the agreement between Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa to create this bank.
Very interesting. It could be a huge deal. How much has China pledged to BRICS Bank so far?
China has pledged to contribute a total of $41 billion to the bank. That would give it the largest voting right at 39.5%. And the bank will have an initial authorized capital of about $100 billion. That's what they're going for. And its initial subscribed capital of $50 billion will be shared equally among the founding members.
Okay, and how exactly is this bank structured between its founding members?
Well, each BRICS member is expected to contribute an equal share in establishing a startup capital of $50 billion, with a goal of ultimately reaching that $100 billion in capitalization that I mentioned before. And the BRICS banks, it will be headquartered in Shanghai, with India presiding as president during the first year and Russia serving as the chairman of the representatives. Now, I want to point out that BRICS, it represents 42% of the world's population and roughly 20% of the world's economy based on GDP, and 30% of the world's GDP based on purchasing power parity, PPP. And also, total trade between the countries, it amounts to over $6 trillion. So certainly not peanuts, and worth looking at not only just the AIIB, but this as well.
No, certainly, and we'll have to have you back on to give us all the developments as this sort of progresses. Erin Ade out of our New York studio, always appreciate your reporting. Thanks so much. It's big deal time. I'm sitting here with the one, the only Ed Harrison, and we are talking tech. Starting with news out of the European Union, the EU has agreed to a preliminary deal to scrap mobile roaming charges across the region by June of 2017. So, Ed, let's start right there. This is a huge deal. I mean, what exactly does this mean for Europeans?
It means it's going to be cheaper to use their mobile, and it's going to be cheaper not just for making telephone calls, but also for using it for texting and for data. And what they're doing is they're making it a sort of a tiered structure where at one point they're going to institute sort of a 5 cent per minute roaming charge for calls, 5 cents per minute for data, and then 2 cents per text. And then they're going to phase that out, and then at that point, there's going to be no roaming charges at all. So that's going to be huge.
That's huge. I mean, it's my sense that we could never see something like this happen in the U.S. I know I am victim to the roaming charges. I used to live in Detroit, and going to Canada all the time, I just got hammered with those roaming charges. So, I mean, what are the obstacles? Why can't we see something like this implemented in the U.S.?
Well, you know, traditionally, the reason that roaming charges existed was because we had a multiplicity of operators, and they each had their roaming interconnect agreements. They had wholesale agreements between one operator and the other in all these different countries. And based upon that, you know, it was a very Byzantine kind of thing, and therefore, supposedly, to deal with that and all of the logistics, we had to pay a lot of money. But over time, number one, we have fewer operators in various places, and those operators are resident in many different locations. And then secondly, you know, it's much easier for these things to happen. So really what's happened is that as sources of revenue, ancillary sources of revenue have diminished, they've gotten this as a huge source of revenue that they can get. You know, people get hit with these enormous bills because they have roamed. And it's not, as it used to be, telephony that was the thing that got people. Now it's data. You know, your data is on in a foreign country. You come home and you have a $600 bill.
And some people don't even know. They have
you don't
no
know
idea.
that that's the case. So that's the reason that it existed before. But the reason that it could happen in the U.S., I believe, is actually because you have companies like T-Mobile who are already instituting this kind of thing, where basically there are no roaming charges internationally. If you join a certain plan, the Simple Connect plan, and as a result of that, you can have 5 cents per minute for your telephony, but it's free for data, free for you know, your texting.
Do you know if this is unprecedented, what the EU is doing?
Yeah, I think that this is, you know, the biggest move because what they're trying to do is they're trying to make a common market. They're trying to say, look, you know, we're one market. There's really no reason for across these different markets to have roaming charges. If we want to really act as if we're one market, then we have to be one market, and that means that we have to get rid of roaming charges. You don't see roaming charges throughout the United States. And so therefore, here in Europe and the EU, we need to have the same sort of common structure.
So do you think it could maybe start a ripple effect in some way? I mean, people here in the U.S. see what the EU is doing and say, hey, why can't we do the same thing?
I think that it's not going to. I think more likely what's going to happen is because of companies like T-Mobile, which is actually a subsidiary of a German company, we're going to see that. So T-Mobile actually is going to be a part of this whole deal in Europe, but they also, their U.S. subsidiary, they benefit from the fact that T-Mobile is resident in so many countries in Europe, and that's why I think that they can actually do this deal where you have 5 cents a minute for roaming charges internationally, you have free data, and you have free texting. So that's actually going to force the other major telecoms in the U.S. to get this sorted in the U.S. Now, just remember, T-Mobile was almost bought by AT&T. So if AT&T had bought T-Mobile, this never would have happened. So a lot of this has to do with competition, and it has to do with we are benefiting from more competition amongst the players.
Okay, well, speaking of competition and antitrust and all that, we're going to move on to this other story out of Apple. A federal appeals court on Tuesday upheld a 2013 decision finding Apple liable for conspiring with publishers to raise the price of ebooks. And Ed, as I understand it, they found that they were in violation of federal antitrust. Can you talk about that? What exactly were they violating?
Well, basically, they were conspiring with these companies in order to rig the prices so that, you know, they control the prices, and as a result of that, over time, that would mean that we as consumers would have to pay more for our books. And these are the sort of things that we've seen happen in other arenas from Apple, in terms of now people are after Apple in terms of Apple Music.
Exactly.
That, you know, they're taking the same practices that they used in books and they're doing this again in music. And the question is not necessarily, are they charging higher prices? The initial question is, are they engaged in activity which will allow them down the line to charge higher prices?
And I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, because as we see them sort of run into these roadblocks, I mean, it can't be a good sign that they're constantly being associated with antitrust. I mean, it's not good for their image, right? Well,
you know, going back to what I was saying about T-Mobile, it's about competition at the end of the day. So Apple is a hegemon at this point. They're a huge company, and the question becomes, given their size, when they enter a market, how are they going to act in that market? And if they're using coercive tactics, as they have been doing in e-books, then what kind of market power will that give them? It gives them a market power to potentially raise prices, but it also gives them the ability to forestall competition. That is, to keep out other players, to create special deals with the publishing companies or with the music companies that says you can't do a deal with these other companies because you need to be with us. And we've seen that already with regard to handsets, that they've gotten deals with AT&T to you know, have the iPhone, and no other companies could have the iPhone. And because of that deal, they were able to enrich themselves, and ultimately that ended up meaning that they could have a premium priced product that people were willing to pay for, just because they could only get it in one place.
Well, it does seem that, you know, as the company grows bigger and starts to spread its tentacles in different things, it starts to, you know, succumb to more and more scrutiny over these things. Well, as a result, the company is expected to pay $450 million, mostly to ebook consumers. That's 3% of the company's profit in the quarter that ended in December. And so really for them, that's kind of chump change, isn't it?
Exactly. It's almost like what happens with the banks. That is that you engage in coercive behavior, and the penalty is not commensurate with your earning potential. And as a result of that, you understand that that coercive behavior is actually something that you could replicate somewhere else. So that's why they're going to potentially do this somewhere else you know, in music, and this is why people are coming down on them. That's why the regulators are saying, wait a minute, let's take a look at this deal, because we want to make sure that we get ahead of the curve in this particular instance.
Indeed. All right, Ed, we've completely run out of time. Could talk to you more and more about the subject. Thank you so much for your insight. That's all for now. We love hearing from you guys. Tweet at us at Erin Ade, at Edward NH, at Ameera David, and at Bianca Facchinei. And remember, you can see all the segments featured in today's show. YouTube at youtube.com/BoomBustRT. From all of us here at BoomBust, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.